Now we'll turn to Nash equilibrium. So Nash equilibrium is the equilibrium in which each player is doing their best given the actions taken by another player. Okay, so the equilibrium is where a player, after they've made their choice, does not want to change that choice in response to what the other person does. Okay, um, it's important that we emphasize the conditional part of that definition, right? It's the best thing that a player can do given the action that opponent has taken. So again, someone in this game, in a given game, doesn't want to change their choice in response to the other player, right? One example of this is seating in a classroom, right? So often I'm sure you've noticed this, right? Um, at the beginning of the semester, you kind of sort of select your seat and then maybe you'll move one or two times, but after a while, everyone sort of settles into where they sit in a classroom. This is a Nash equilibrium where, given where everyone else in the class is sitting, no one wants to change their spot. Another example of Nash equilibrium is the lines at the grocery store, right? So when you're going to check out, you select your checkout lane given where everyone else is in line, all right? And once you've selected, likely you don't want to change the lane you've selected, right? Maybe until another player enters, right? And then the game has changed. But given everyone who's already there, you make your choice and don't want to change your checkout lane. All right, so that's a Nash equilibrium. When we look at the game that we previously analyzed, we found that the Nash equilibrium was at advertise sell because neither company wants to change their behavior given that the other firm is advertising, right? If they did, they would be losing money instead of gaining 250 million. This type of game is a prisoner's dilemma game. And so the Nash equilibrium for a prisoner's dilemma game is always going to be worse than another possible outcome that is unstable, right? So for Disney and Warner Brothers, they would really like to be in the don't advertise equilibrium because that allows them to earn 320 million, right? Instead of 250 million, they could increase their payoff by 70 million. But because they could easily, if one of them, if they're both in that don't advertise equilibrium, and one of them moves to advertise, right, that person is going to get 550 million while the other firm is not advertising by advertising themselves, right? So if Disney's not advertising and then Warner Brothers switches to advertising, they get 550 million while Disney now is earning negative 80. And so they both end up advertising in response to these payoffs. They both would like 550 over 320. And likewise, they don't want to make a loss. And so they both end up advertising to avoid the scenario where they end up earning a loss because they've not advertised and their opponent has. And so this is what defines a prisoner's dilemma game, this incentive structure, where each player, regardless of what the other does, selects the strategy that places them in the worse off equilibrium. Okay. Here's another example. This one is set up to align more with the usual story behind the prisoner's dilemma game, where we have two people who have been arrested for something like robbing a bank and separated, and they're being interrogated in different rooms, right? And they each face the choice to either cooperate with each other and remain silent or defect on their partner and it pin the crime on them. So with regard to the payoffs, we see that if they both cooperate, they're jailed just for 1 year. But if one cooperates, right, maybe player two cooperates while player one defects, player one gets off scot-free while player two is incarcerated for 5 years. And then if the reverse is true, right, player one cooperates and player two defects, then player one is incarcerated for 5 years while player two gets off scot-free. And then if they both defect, they're both incarcerated for 3 years, right? If we look at this game, the best outcome for these players is that cooperate, sell, right? However, that is an unstable equilibrium, right? Meaning it's not. right? It's not equilibrium needs to be stable. Because in this cooperate cell, player one has an incentive to defect, right? Rather than serving 1 year, they could get off scot-free. Similarly, player two has an incentive to defect. Rather than serving 1 year, they could get off scot-free. So what ends up happening is they both defect and they end up in that suboptimal equilibrium where they're both ratting each other out and serving 3 years in jail. Okay. And so this is why we call this type of game, again, a prisoner's dilemma, because in that hypothetical scenario where they're separated in interrogation rooms, they face this really high incentive to rat on their partner and thus end up worse off overall. Okay. Let's look at another game. So here we have a more complicated game where we have two players, Samuel and Janice, excuse me, Samuel and Janice, who both face now three strategies that they could take. Open, expand, or do nothing, right? In this case, both are operating businesses, and so they are choosing what to do given that they're in the same market, all right? So how we analyze this more complicated game is just the same as when it's just a 2x2 matrix. We're going to look at each player's strategy one at a time and see if there's any dominant strategies here. So let's start with Samuel. So assume that Janice chooses open. We're going to compare all of Samuel's payoffs, right? If he opens, he earns 250 million. If he expands, he earns 150 million. If he does nothing, he gets 200. So of those, he prefers open, right? Because that gives him the highest payoff. If instead Janice expands, now we're comparing the 180, 150, and 160 that Samuel could earn if he opens, expands, or does nothing, right? Respectively. In this case, again, he prefers to open. That gets him the highest payoff. In the third strategy that Janice can take, Samuel is comparing 200 million for opening, 175 for expanding, and 150 for doing nothing. Again, he prefers open. That gives him the largest payoff. And so we see very clearly that Samuel has a dominant strategy, and that is open, right? Regardless of what Janice does, he is going to open his store. Knowing that, now we can look at Janice's options. So she knows Samuel's going to open. That's his dominant strategy. That's what he's going to do every time, regardless of what she does. So she wants to maximize her payoffs in response. So when Samuel opens, Janice could open and get 250. She could expand and get 260, or she could do nothing and get 300. And so what she's going to end up doing is doing nothing because that's her maximum possible payoff. And so the Nash equilibrium for this game is when Samuel opens and Janice does nothing, such that Samuel gets a payoff of 200 million and Janice gets a payoff of 300, all right, million. Okay. And the slides here walk you through that, right? So they're deciding regarding their competing coffee shops what to do. Samuel's dominant strategy is to open. So in response, Janice is going to do nothing. Okay. All right. Sometimes there might be more than one equilibrium in a game, right? So in the game shown here, this is this standard chicken game. If you don't know what chicken is, usually it's when two people are in cars and they drive at each other head on. And the person who swerves is the person who loses, and the person who drives straight, they win. Okay. However, if they both drive straight, they're going to crash, right? So in the end, they both lose, right? Because their cars are totaled. So what we're going to see in chicken is there's not going to be a single equilibrium because players are going to want to randomize what they do in order to ensure that they win most often. Okay, this is what we call a mixed strategy equilibrium. It's where players are going to sort of bounce, like I said, between the two strategies in order to randomize their action so their opponent doesn't know what they do. So player one and player two are going to want to randomize effectively between swerve and straight such that their opponent is not sure when they're going to swerve and when they're going to drive straight, okay? Another example of this is penalty kicks. Let me see if I have it here. So if you know anything about soccer, you know that sometimes penalty kicks occur in games where it's just the kicker within the box and the goalie, right? The 18-yard box. Here, both players want to randomize, right? The distance, the penalty kick is usually is set up about 6 yards, a little over 6 yards from the goal, and it's so close that a goalie cannot reliably react and catch the ball, right? Stop the player from scoring. And so what the kicker and goalie want to do is randomize what direction they go such that when the penalty kick happens, neither knows which direction the other is going to pick, right? Is the player going to kick left or right? And is the goalie going to dive left or right? Right? Um, Within soccer, often players who will be taking penalty kicks study goalie tapes to see how they usually respond to penalty kicks. So that's why the goalie wants to randomize so that the player can't know for sure which direction they're going. Similarly, goalies will study player tapes to see which direction players usually select when they are taking a penalty kick. Okay. And so ideally, the strategy is for each of them to go left and right 50% of the time, such that they don't know which the other is going to select. Okay. And in this payoff, we see that the player benefits when the goalie goes a different direction from them, but the keeper, or excuse me, the goalie benefits when they go the same direction as the player. Okay. So there's that payoff for you. Okay. Next, we're going to turn to repeated games, which will be in the next video.